not be working. The audio might 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 not be working. Can somebody fix it? Okay. Can somebody confirm that is the audio working now? Can somebody confirm that is the audio working now? Can somebody confirm that is the audio working now? Can somebody confirm that is the audio working now? Can somebody? Hello.
Hello, Matt. Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, just hold on. In the next 1 minute,
Okay, good.
Hello, Mike. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, can you go on now?
Okay, let's try this again. And then you're doing the slides as well. In 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 the slides as well. It is quite funny. We can laugh about this. Hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Hello, Mark. You can go ahead now. I think the audio is okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's try this again. So hopefully this is working. If somebody can give a sign, if the audience can wave to show that the audio is working. Yeah, good. Excellent. Hi, everybody. Let me start off by telling you a story about Einstein. Einstein used to teach undergraduate physics at Princeton University. His second-year students, undergraduate students, would get a shock because when they went into the examination hall, in front of them would be last year's questions. Eventually, a brave student would put up their hand and say, "Excuse me, Professor Einstein, you've made a mistake because you've given us last year's questions." Einstein would just smile and say, "Well, whilst it's true that I've given you last year's questions, this year, the answers are all different." If you look at the work that I've been doing on scaling, if you look at the sort of the rise of Africa as an economic and social powerhouse, right now we can have the same questions that may have been asked year after year after year, but right now we really are seeing some fundamentally different ways of approaching the world. And what I like to do is share the research work that I've done on really understanding how do small things grow very, very large. And sharing that not just from a theoretical and maybe somewhat sort of conceptual perspective, which is still very important, but also to share some very, very practical examples that will work for businesses, that also work for social business and societal change as well. Because fundamentally, I'm a deeply practical person. So right now, I'm going to give some very, very practical examples to help. And I'll actually start off with an African example of a project that I was involved in with scaling. Now, if you go to the next slide, this will have the slide with the sort of counting bones. I had an opportunity in January of 2008 to go to the World Economic Forum at Davos. So there you have all kinds of CEOs, presidents of countries. And when I was there, I met somebody from the opposition party in Zimbabwe. And I described the work that I was doing on scaling and spreading and also the sort of the power of collective intelligence. And he said, by the way, can everybody hear me okay? Still good? I'll assume yes, unless somebody shouts out. Good. So he said, look, we're fighting an election, and we know that honestly the opposition party, the MDC, will win the election. However, we know that the election is likely to be stolen. It'll be stolen before, during, and after, like all good elections can be. And what he was asking for me was my help. Could I use the power of the collective, the power of scaling, to do a few small, smart things to change the outcome of an election, to have a free and fair vote under impossible circumstances? Well, I didn't know anything about Zimbabwe, even though my parents are South African. I'd never been to the country. I didn't know anything about elections. I didn't even have internet access in Davos. But what I did is that I'm sort of going off a rule book of the science that I've been developing that I'll be sharing with you today. So began to look at, well, okay, sort of how many people live in Zimbabwe? About 13 million. How was the vote actually going to be stolen? Well, unfortunately, it's a sad fact that you steal elections before, during, and after. But the primary way of doing it is you buy off election officials, so that you actually don't care what people vote because you already know what the result is going to be. But this actually had a very interesting phenomenon, because it actually means that in most cases the voting is honest, because it's too expensive to cheat everywhere. So I then began to look at using the power of the masses. What you see on that second slide there should be somebody's finger pointing at a table of results. My idea was to pretty much crowdsource the election. By that, we ended up getting 1,000 people with camera phones, who already had camera phones as it happened, to stand next to the polling stations. None of these people knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't even were told to take pictures until the very last minute, and that was because we had to be concerned for informers and other things. But the 1,000 biggest polling stations then had people covering them, and what you see there is one of the pictures that was taken of the local results from one of the polling stations. Those 1,000 pictures were then sent over to a website in South Africa, where 10 people, students, turned the pictures into a big spreadsheet. And within just a few hours, this group of activists, for zero budget, without anybody knowing that it's happening, had counted over a third of the possible vote in Zimbabwe, and can prove with physical evidence, so documented physical evidence, that the opposition was winning by 66%, and Mugabe had no chance of getting over 50% majority. That activity took about 10 man-hours to plan, design, and execute, so truly a small, smart piece of work, and ended up in a transition government coming in place. Unfortunately, we should have had more people with camera phones to take more of the vote.
From your camera.
But at least there was a transition government in place, and things did improve economically, at least for that interim parliament. The reason why I'm sharing that story with you is that it shows on sort of a practical example of this, and this just happens to be a non-business example, but it is possible to use these small, smart moves quite deliberately to have huge, dramatic impact for very, very little effort. If we move to the next slide, which will have the picture of the little tree. So what I've been looking at then is that when we start thinking about sort of the creation of new things, there is the seeding stage, which is the brand new thing needs to sort of be created and be nurtured. And then there is the scaling phase. And that is very much where the thing, you really only get true economic value once you scale that thing. So right now, if you have a retail operation, and let's say you have one store, but you have visions of having more, well, you'll only get real scale if you manage to get to 100 stores. So this then goes into the game about how do you really scale things? How do you scale ideas from very, very small to very, very large? And if we go to the next slide, the word scaling has meant different things to different people, but I've come up with my own definition of this, which I think is quite broad, quite comprehensive, and it gives us some new notions about how to look at scaling. For me, very much, scaling is about how do you achieve outsized results. So results much, much bigger than one would normally expect, certainly with linear investment of time and resource. And how do you do that? Through small, smart moves, aided by good fortune. And if I describe that, so you have small moves, so this means that you're not spending $1 million on an advert. You're doing very clever things.
They sent it in mobile format.
The,
Did they send in another PDF format?
and by the way, I've got some audio in the background from somebody else. Okay. I'll assume that my stuff is still working. These are smart moves in that these are actions, plans, activities that you design on purpose. But then there is also just the acknowledgement that sometimes you really can be aided by good luck, good fortune, in the same way that sometimes you can have a most brilliant idea and it just gets stuck because of bad fortune. So we can't ignore the existence of fortune. What we can do is take advantage of it, and we can also put ourselves in the position for good fortune to take place. In fact, when I gave you the Zimbabwe story, what I'd actually done is that I was trying to find a pilot project to show how these methods of scaling could be used to do social change, and it just happened that the person that I met at the shuttle bus at 7 o'clock in the morning came from Zimbabwe. It could have been anybody. But so sometimes you have good fortune. I'm going to share with you two stories, and this will then illustrate sort of the pieces of scaling. And if you go to the first slide, the next slide will have a picture of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall it's a fascinating story because pretty much communism ended. So 40 years of communism and the Iron Curtain ended in less than 24 hours without anybody having a clue what was going on. It was truly aided by good fortune. If we track back in history, so in the mid-1980s, Gorbachev had been the premier in Russia, and Gorbachev had perestroika and glasnost. That meant that Russia was the Soviet Union was fairly busy on Russia itself, and they didn't care too much what the satellite states were doing. So there was this moment of openness. What happened then in Poland in '88, the Solidarity movement, the trade union movement, had been growing in strength. And at the end of '88, they had a series of strikes in mines and industrial places. The Polish Politburo, in order to take the pressure out of the system, decided to allow Solidarity to have a legal stance and to actually be able to be voted in for elections. And in April of '89, Solidarity won over 90% of the vote in any place where they had a competitive seat. A week or so later, the Hungarian government decides, seeing that nothing is happening in Poland, that they would open its borders. Now what this meant was that if you could get to Hungary, anybody, and particularly East Germans, could then escape and become refugees in West Germany. The problem was that it took about 2 years to get a passport and a visa. So that it meant for practical purposes, it was almost impossible for people to travel. You then, through that period, through '89, through the summer, there were a series of candlelit marches in Leipzig of people demanding the right to travel. So really very harmless. There were people that fled to the Czech Republic and to Poland, where they then began to camp out in the embassy. So there were 3,000 people in the Prague embassy trying to escape to West Germany.
This for the PowerPoint. Okay.
There were then, the pressure built up. There was the 40th anniversary of the GDR, and you even had a group of students when Gorbachev was there saying, please don't send the tanks in. And at the beginning of November, the government allowed to sort of calm the situation down. The government allowed a group of actors to hold a rally in the middle of Alexanderplatz. And about 250,000 people turned up at this rally, just a few days before the wall came down. But what's remarkable with that story is that there wasn't a single person asking for reunification, not a single person asking for the fall of the wall. They were asking for freedom of speech and freedom of movement, and that was it.
I've opened it right now.
On the morning of November the 9th, a group of very junior people from the military and the secret services had been given a task of coming up with a new plan to reduce social pressure. And they decided that if you wanted to be a refugee, you could leave the country immediately. The army guy felt that it was unfair that it only applied to refugees, and so he managed to say that also if you wanted to travel to the West, you could do. Well, these were junior people, and they knew that this was going to be reviewed at a Politburo meeting at 7 p.m. at night later on that day. So this was a draft, if you like. The interim head of state, Egon Kranz, had got this document, and without really appreciating that it hadn't been finalized, with also that it was under embargo in any case until 4 o'clock the next morning, he gave it to a guy called Gunter Schabowski, who was the Communist Party spokesperson, just before a 6 p.m. Press conference. Now, very unusually, this press conference was broadcast live to the international press, not inside of East Germany, but live to the Western press, without realizing, of course, that people in the East could watch Western news. And for the first 15 minutes, they didn't even discuss travel. And there were two journalists right at the end that asked the question, well, is there any change to travel restrictions? This poor spokesperson, I mean, he read off the sheet, if you want to be a refugee, you can do so. And when he was asked when the restrictions were lifted, he said immediately. He didn't know. He didn't know that it was under embargo. Things become very interesting at 5 minutes past 7, because Associated Press, they put a press release out saying, East German borders now open. That was the headline. And the text included the detail. But that headline began to spread very quickly. And even though the newspaper, the news stations shared the details, right now the headline was spreading, the borders are open. And at 10 minutes past 7, you have Chancellor Kohl in Poland finds out about this news. He immediately sees the significance and rushes back home. You also then have at about 7:30 a guy called Harald Jäger, who's lieutenant colonel in the border guards in East Germany. And he's having a sausage and beer, watching the West German press, and he sees this news story. He thinks to himself, oh goodness. Rushes down to his border checkpoint, where there's already a group of people waiting patiently with their passports to become refugees. He tells them, no, we don't know what's going on. He's talking to his bosses. Eventually, the bosses decide that for the people that are shouting the loudest about wanting to go through, they would be allowed to go through. Well, this now all of a sudden meant that people were going through. So in retrospect, maybe not such a good idea. Well, at 10:30, the East German government decides to put a clampdown on it and put out a statement live broadcast across all East Germany to say the borders are not down, that in fact it's the policy will be introduced over a period of time. Unfortunately, at exactly the same time, there was a West German cameraman doing a report outside one of the border checkpoints showing how many people were going through the borders. Sure enough, 1 hour later, there's 1 million people in East Berlin, and Harald Jäger, the border captain, made a personal decision to open the wall. You end up with a set of small moves. 1 year later, there's reunification. These small set of moves, not smartly made, but accidentally made a huge difference to the lives of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Now, that story very often makes me cry. I live in Berlin. I don't have a picture of the Berlin Wall sort of sitting behind me. But the next story will definitely not make me cry, and this is really a story about how businesses can become very large and become billion-dollar businesses through small, smart moves. And if we go to the next slide, here we will see what is sadly so if you go to the next slide with the time. So the fastest selling book of all history to reach 100 million copies in just 2 years was 50 Shades of Grey. Now, I don't know if you have 50 Shades of Grey in Nigeria. I would imagine so, since it is everywhere. 50 Shades of Grey is a billion-dollar business created out of practically nothing. And if we look at this outsized result, the next best-selling book on pornography had sold about 1 million copies, so it was so much bigger than anything else. What it shows is that this was very much done on purpose. There was a set of deliberate moves. And I'll be sharing some thoughts afterwards about how planned they were in advance, but it was very deliberate. And this will start to give you the sort of toolkit of scaling in there. So the author is Erica Leonard. She's a London woman. Her husband is a TV producer. Over the Christmas of 2008, she was given the Twilight book series. And after she finished writing the book series, she began to write. And so in January 2009, she started writing a book that she called Master of the Universe. Now, by using the Twilight as a platform, this was a platform that already had 130 million readers. And she was kind of guaranteed that selling anything into that market, you can easily persuade 0.5% of the population to buy in. So she picked a platform to base her new product on. She'd written it, was writing chapters every single week. In August of 2009, she found some crowdsourcing websites. So this is sites where people can go in and share things for free, share comments. So there were two fan fiction websites, and she posted her content there for free. Now, she hadn't finished writing the book, and she began to publish a chapter every single week. This was a very smart move, because what it meant was that her writing style needed to be very captivating, to like a TV soap opera, to make you want to watch the next one. The other thing it did is that she was synchronizing her audience. Her audience, and you could tell this through the Facebook fan pages at the time, were really expecting her to do things. When's the next chapter? When's the next chapter coming out? So that was a very good way of getting her early fan base to be strongly behind her. The other benefit she had about using the masses was she could use their brain power. So, for example, she lives in London. She hadn't been to Seattle. So right now, she had people termed beta readers who were living in Seattle giving her advice on, let's say, they wouldn't get a Starbucks, they'd get a Peet's Coffee, that kind of thing. Even the title of the book. When she decided to change the title of the book, there was one phrase that really resonated. By the way, the book is terrible. It's really, really bad. I will happily admit I've only read the first 14 chapters. I find it basically unreadable. However, people do love it. But in chapter 16, so I haven't got that far, there's one moment when Anna strokes Christian, wants to stroke her lover, and he says, "Don't touch me because I'm 50 shades of fucked up." So the fans loved 50 Shades. And so quite quickly, her website became 50 Shades, and she titled the book 50 Shades of Grey. There was a moment of good fortune. So there were three mothers who were raising money for a children's cancer charity. And what they were doing is collecting donations to fund an outtake chapter from people's favorite fan fiction authors. What this meant is that she was one of several authors. Her book was already on the top 10 list, so that meant that and because it's on the top 10 list, more and more people were following her. Well, her chapter raised $28,000 as a single outtake chapter, $28,000 in just a couple of weeks. Up until that time, everything has been done for free. She can now clearly see, with 110 chapters under her belt, that she could very, very easily make some money out of this. So she pulled all of the content off the internet and did a deal with the Writers Cafe, an independent publisher based out of Australia. Some of her fans were very upset that she'd done this. Many of her fans had only just started discovering her content, and all of a sudden the free content had disappeared. But she did have this new book that was coming out, and many people wanted to have the physical print version, or what was going to become the ebook version as well. So that book was then published in September 2011, and quite quickly it sold 250,000 copies. The way that she managed to get it out there, if you look at the book itself, there's something that we call infectious ideas. If you're looking to spread something and truly scale it, one way of thinking about your idea is make it infectious. Well, there are different ways of having it infectious. In fact, the front cover is very nondescript. Up until that time, most pornographic novels had pictures of body parts on it. Right now, this is a black cover with a tie on it. I mean, nothing could be more harmless. This allowed supermarkets and airports to, put it in the front of all of the desks so that people could see it. In addition to that, there was something here, and this has given me some great insight about sort of how smart she was, or how much the smarts came by emergence, or she made intelligent moves almost by accident. What normally would happen if you're an author working with a publisher is that you would do a book tour. So you would then plan to be in several cities, one after the other, but that's fairly expensive. She not only didn't have any money, she didn't have a publisher. So when she was starting writing this book, she didn't have the ability to make these kind of big, long-term plans and nobody to work with. When she did the publishing deal with the Writers Cafe, we were able to turn the book around really fast. There was no budget for a roadshow. So she managed to take advantage of what was called a virtual book tour. She was one of the leaders of this. And even right now, with me being present with you in Lagos at the moment, I'm taking advantage of her little tactic. What it meant was that in 1 week, she was able to be in 11 cities virtually and build up a buzz around her book. In addition to that, she found what's called a hub and an amplifier. So within a network structure, you have certain people, organizations that sort of live in the center. Well, one of the hubs in the sort of publishing center in the sort of East Coast New York scene is a mommy website called Divalicious Moms. Well, the owner of Divalicious Moms had come across through these the outreach programs, had come across 50 Shades, had loved it, and had decided to do a whole bunch of radio show interviews and talking about 50 Shades of Grey. She then contacted the author, and the author was invited to New York to an exclusive 200-person sort of Manhattan loft. Copies of her book were being sold for $700 the next day on eBay, so it was very successful. And just a few weeks after that, given that she was now in the publishing scene, she got a 7-figure book deal with Random House, with vintage books from Random House. Well, Random House then is definitely a hub, and it's also an amplifier, because it's all very well having a small bookseller, but as soon as you get a really big partner, that big partner adds credibility. On the 9th of March 2012, the New York Times puts basically the first public story, big story, about 50 Shades, which they can now do because it's got Random House behind it. And it's interesting that when you look at the picture from that newspaper, you have stacks of the books, and there's a post-it note on top saying, this is the book everybody is talking about. Beginning to use that social pressure of people wanting to be included as a way of persuading people to go buy it. Quite quickly, once the book had come out, it hit popular press. There were people saying it's the mummification of pornography. Some people were complaining about the writing, but it meant that it was all over the press. She was able to catch a few waves also. So she caught the wave of ebooks. So we'll go into this catching the wave thing a little bit. But so people had started to use ebooks more often. So Kindle, iPad readers. Half of the sales of a book in the United Kingdom were on the ebook. So she was able to take advantage of that wave. She was even able to ride the wave. So when the decision was taken to turn it into a movie, well, that movie gives you a whole bunch of different press to talk about. And I even believe that there was this male actor who was meant to play the lead role who was there for 2 months and dropped out. I think it's entirely plausible that he was paid to pretend to be the lead because they kept the story hot. Well, the result of this, and the sort of what happened next then, is that people began to need to read it because everybody's reading it. It's on the top 10 lists. It's on the front of every store. The result was that in the first 2 months alone, it sold 30 million copies around the world. And over 2 years, it has become the fastest selling book of all human history, notwithstanding the fact that it's not very good and is about pornography. That is definitely a story of scaling. Now, if I look at the Berlin Wall story, that was an accident. If I look at the story of 50 Shades of Grey, that was on purpose, but with a very odd twist. A series of very, very smart decisions were made to actually drive this thing out. And yet at the same time, there was no grand plan. There was no design. In fact, what actually happens is she managed to come up with her plan through emergence. Because almost there was no other choice to make. Because she didn't have enough money, she couldn't do a physical book tour, but she's allowed to do a book tour, so she did a virtual one. What I'm going to be sharing with you now then is like the sort of the secrets that underpin the scaling method, and then we'll begin to go into the frames, and I don't know, hopefully we'll have some ability to take some questions as well. But I don't know if there's any questions on those 2 case studies, and then otherwise I can move on to the concept piece. Any questions?
Hey, this guy going on. This guy using my Cosmos!
Any questions? Okay, so I will. I'll keep going then. So if I look at why this thing works, if we go to the next slide, this slide will have emergence on it.
He has not gone now.
He's on emergence now.
He's just going into emergence
He was already
now.
talked about it. That's why I'm here.
Okay, so if you look at this, then the first concept is one of emergence. Now I'm going to take you through the science of this thing, and I'm going to make it really simple.
Oh, you're just discussing it
So
now.
to look at emergence then, what we have is that we have, let's call it people. So like we're in a room full of people. As soon as you have 2 or more people, we've got a memory. So we don't just sort of randomly move about from where we were a second ago. So we have what's called a state memory. We're also giving off signals. We're giving off signals by our presence, by our look, whether we smile, who we look at, who we don't look at. We're constantly giving off signals. And we're also picking up signals from other people, from the environment. So we have a memory. We have signaling behavior. The last thing is we have a progression over time. So second 1, second 2, second 3.
How long is it?
Now, what's interesting now, if we look at this sort of the room that we're in, well, right now, we can treat this group of humans, like your group right now, as being a complex system. But already then, if we just sort of think and look inside of our own bodies, our body is a complex system. The brain is very much of a complex system, so it has neurons that interconnect. If we then look at the room that you're in, the building that you're in is also a complex system. So you're a system inside of a system, and you're connected to elements outside of that system as well. So in fact, we're really looking at huge systems of systems taking place. But what's very interesting is that it really does allow a change in one part of the system to change everything. If somebody, whatever, didn't sort of suddenly starts a fire because of a cigarette was dropped outside, all of a sudden everybody would have to leave the room. So a single action can change everything in the system. Now, what's very interesting then is that this system becomes extremely complicated, because if you think about all of those people and all of those things that could be happening, our brains should probably literally explode with the complexity, and yet we don't. And the reason is that when we're giving off signals and picking up signals, we have a rules engine. Just like when you go into a cash point and you put your cash point card in, the bank says, is this card active and how much money do you have in order for me to give you some? It's a rules engine. Well, our brains have rules engine, just as other things in complex systems, or even sort of plants, the stars have got a rules engine. And what these rules do is they mainly help us to conserve energy, because it takes energy to keep moving around. And you end up with rules that are very interesting and very sort of understandable for us as humans. So there's a rule of follow your peers. So see people that are like you and copy what they do. Keep doing what you are doing until there is a compelling reason to change. This, again, is a conservation of energy rule. If in doubt, go for the one you know. Well, those 3 rules alone explain about 70% of human behavior. And this will become an extremely important scaling activity, because it now means that we don't need to really convince everybody to go do things. We can convince a small number of people to make a move and then persuade other people to go follow them. So it's really going to be a very useful thing for us to go scale. But now what's interesting, if we look at that thing within emergence, is that we have people interacting, and we should keep doing what we're doing, the same as before, and follow your peers. But you should have a system where, aside from these accidental moments, like the Berlin Wall story, you shouldn't really have change. But now what's very interesting, we're now going to look at a standing ovation. So if you look at like the room that you're in, and but if you imagine, actually, it's sort of a banked auditorium is not quite as good as as a flat one. But if you imagine 1,000 people sitting in an auditorium, right now a standing ovation is very difficult to have started from the back of the room. And there are 3 reasons for this. The first reason is that you can't see the deviation. So if you're sitting in the middle, you can't see somebody behind you standing up. The second thing is, what you can see is everybody seated. So your reference model of the peers is people are seated. And you can see yourself, and you know that you are seated. So right now, because of those 3 things, it means then that right now it's very hard to get a standing ovation to start from the back. So standing ovations almost needs to come from the front. Maybe you paid more money for your ticket. You bought your ticket earlier. Maybe you just want to stand up and go to the toilet. What we find when we look at scaling is that sometimes it doesn't matter what the spark was. People will follow anyway. So now you have the first person standing. What happens in the next second is the people that see the deviation, see the person standing, make a decision. Do I keep doing what I'm doing, which is seated as everybody else is, or do I follow the deviant? It turns out people have a relative propensity to follow deviations. Some people, let's say, I might stand if I see one other person standing, whereas maybe some of you in the audience will only stand if there's 100 people standing. Well, now what's very interesting is that in what's called a positive pickup, you can go from 1 person to 6, and then in the next wave of pickup, maybe 6 to 20. When that happens, all of a sudden the rules of the system completely change. So now, even if people thought the performance was bad, they're just sort of quite tired. Now what happens with the standing ovation is that almost the entire room stands up in unison at almost exactly the same time, but not quite. And the fundamental reason for that goes back to this notion of signaling. To be in the system, we need to give off signals and pick up signals. And if somebody is standing right in front of us because they're doing the standing clap, this means that we can't see what's going on, so we have to stand up. This gives us some really important insights when you look at scaling, and even if you look at motivations, like why do people do things? Very often the reason why people do things is not because of love, fear. They do things because other people are doing things.
Okay.
And there's a nice analogy that I like of the donkey. So quite often at business schools we're taught about you need to get the donkey to move, you need the carrot or the stick. So positive incentives or the threats of repercussion. But the thing is that there is another thing that is much more powerful than carrots and sticks on donkeys, and that is other donkeys. And I've even done this experiment with wild horses outside of Berlin, where you throw the carrots out and the donkeys don't pay any attention. Finally, one donkey sort of notices that there's a change, like, oh, something different has happened. Their eyesight isn't that good, so they don't know that it's a carrot, and they go and wander off to go look. The donkey sitting next to the first donkey thinks, where have you gone? I'm going to follow you. The next batch of donkeys think, they're all over there, we need to go. And that last poor donkey that is sitting chewing on grass suddenly looks up and they're all alone. So they go follow too. This is really, really important when it comes to scaling, because it means as a design, you don't need to change everybody's behavior. You focus on the few, you focus on the followship, which you can design, and then that'll allow you to sort of scale out to the masses. If we move to the next slide. So now we've got to look, after emergence, we're looking at networks.
Slide.
Networks.
Yeah, that's it. So one of the interesting things then is that if you look at these complex systems, very often you have them in a network structure. So right now, a network could be the alumni of a business school. It could be the company that you're with. You've got family networks, your football club networks. There are all kinds of networks. What's very interesting with networks in terms of scaling is that it dramatically increases the possibility of things spreading within the network, and it increases the speed that it can spread. Let me just go back to that Zimbabwe story that I gave you at the beginning. And that might be a question that you were asking, which is, how the hell do you get 1,000 people with camera phones in Zimbabwe in 2008, given that you can't tell anybody what you're doing? That looks like an impossible task, and yet it took 30 minutes. The reason why it took 30 minutes was that the first logic that we have in designing these things is be really pretty lazy. So being lazy, we just needed to find out people that had camera phones. And it turns out that even then, 60% of Zimbabweans had mobiles, so we could rely on the mobile phone. The second thing then is that everybody exists in a network. So the activation tactic is you find a network that exists that is somewhat parallel to what you're doing. Either infiltrate that network, be part of it, or persuade a member of that network to then somehow activate the network. Well, for Zimbabwe, the MDC had 15,000 supporters, so the opposition party used its own pre-existing network, and Arthur Mutambara, who became the deputy prime minister, was then able to send a message out to 15,000 people to saying, do you have a camera phone, are you willing to help? And 1,000 people said yes. Networks gives us a really, really powerful structure to spread things. If we look at the hubs and amplifiers, by targeting Devalicious moms, Erica Leonard, the author of 50 Shades of Grey, was able to negotiate a 7-figure book deal within about 4 weeks by using the power of networks. So this is not networking in the sense of sort of going out to meet people, but this is networks. But there is going to be an interesting aspect. So now we're just going to sort of think about networking. So now you've got your group of whatever, 500 people, you're having an event. One of the interesting things there, if we look at that network, I'd like you to imagine, let's say, 2 scenarios. So one scenario is that you're looking to hire a new marketing intern. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is that you're looking to raise $1 million for a new venture that you're running. Well, we have the same group of 500 people, you are the same you, and yet your end goal changes your perception of that network, and it may entirely change the functioning of that network, because it's unlikely that that's going to be the same person. It's impossible it's the same person. But so having an end goal in a network changes the way that you adapt to that system. Very, very important with end goals, and that really then begins to show how the network activates when you give it an end goal. The final thing that I'll talk about in terms of theory then is the wave, so it's the next slide. So one of the interesting things then with this sort of complex system, and remember, it's just simple stuff. So it takes a lot of energy when you're sort of trying to find your place, but as soon as you've found your place in the system, it takes you less energy, because now you're following other people and you keep doing what you're already doing. In this case, then, it means that many systems have a surplus of energy in the system. So because it took a lot of energy to, let's say, find your place, move around, well, as soon as you're seated, you actually have an excess of energy. So both the system has energy and individuals have energy. Well, what it's possible to do then is actually make change on the scale of the entire system at exactly the same time. That standing ovation, for example, takes the power of waves to pretty much spread from that first group of 20 people across the entire system, and it spreads as a wave. So what waves allow you to do then, it gives you things like unleashing a wave. So where there's energy in a system already, you can tap into it and then sort of allow it to explode, as Facebook very much did with its social network. You can catch a wave, as there's been done with the example from 50 Shades of Grey of catching onto the wave of the Kindle ebooks. There's another example of catching the wave. There's a group that I've been working with that do called Love Matters, and they do information around sex and relationships around the world in very challenging countries where there's a lot of taboos. Well, in India, they have a team that is sadly waiting for the next sort of crime against women. And as soon as that happens, and it sadly probably will do for the next maybe 5 or 10 years, they have a marketing team and a PR team that is able to take advantage of that to boost awareness of their own site and to help them make an offer. So they're ready to catch the waves. They're not creating it. They're just jumping onto the waves that are there. And then the last type is unleashing a wave, because riding a wave. So, for example, in 50 Shades of Grey, by having the movie deal, this pretty much gives an extra 2 years of almost being in the press every week or two, every week in newspapers all around the world. It's a way of riding those waves. So those three things then give us, let's say, the conceptual underpinnings. And if you move to the next slide. The reason why I've given you this, and I'm not just saying sort of use Twitter, use social media and the basics, is that I've found that quite often when a method is shared, people use the method and then it stops working. So if we were reading a 5-year-old book on social media, none of the tools and methods in there will be useful, and that's because everybody uses them now. So what I've been trying to do is really find some fundamental ways of looking at the world in a completely different way. And if you remember that Zimbabwe story, normal people don't do this kind of stuff, and now I'm just sort of sharing these tactics with the world. To have then a conceptual framework that allows us to really understand things in a way that can last over decades rather than just sort of a one-year wonder. But then clearly what we need to do is we need to be very practical. And we get practical by turning those concepts into what I call frames. So the picture frame behind me. And if we go to the next slide, this is really then the meat of the toolkit, and these things are all sort of very much explained in the book that I have. These things are what's called scaling frames. And these are different ways of looking at a problem or challenge that you're working on to give you a set of perspectives. If I give you an example, I've got the slides on my thing here. If I use one called balancing control. So this is an emergence. What the balancing control frame says, you can pretty much have a more scalable product if you give some of the features and tools over to your users and your customers. So rather than you deciding on that you will do everything, you pretty much allow your customers to do more of the work so that they configure it. And then if you're really clever, you then find out those configurations that your customers really like, and then you scale from there. So this balancing control is then a way of looking at your product set. This is very much done in software, but other areas as well, more and more, to see how much you should do. There's a great case study that I like from one of the Dow Chemical divisions that were making bulk silicon products. Well, they discovered that it's a commodity market, so therefore the margins are very slim. And they separated out that market into two. So they've got their high-end bit with these sort of complex, sort of low-volume products. But then they created a new company that pretty much completely standardized that you could buy 3 different volumes, and you had to pay $700 if you want somebody on the phone. Well, that commodity business then, by then saying, well, okay, we're going to allow more control over what people do in that area, created a very, very successful business without having to have the same level of cost across both sides of that business. So that was a way that they used for balancing control. Let's try a scene. Can pick out another one. If we look then at building a movement, so there are more and more initiatives where you actually want to get many, many people behind what you're doing. Now, this doesn't just have to be a social movement. These can also be business movements. Right now, lobbying can be very, very effectively done sort of as part of a movement. So it's not just one company trying to do something. There's actually a movement of companies that are trying to organize to build movements over time. Another thing that lives in the world of waves that I very much like is building a crescendo. You don't have to do everything at once. You can actually plan for your series of events, one after the other, that gradually build to lead to this sort of great finale. And what this does, it saves effort. If you look at synchronization, so 50 Shades of Grey did this by having the chapter coming out every single week. Companies do this internally by having weekly meetings on the same day. That creates a sort of synchronized heartbeat within the system. But then you can also begin to sort of build expectation into the market. So Star Wars, the sort of a trilogy of trilogies, pretty much sets up in advance that the movie will come out in 2017, and then the next one will come out in 2020, the next one will be here, and it's really creating that sense of expectation within the market that you're in about people actually sort of wanting to do something and being prepared for doing things. What I'll just do is I'll move to the next slide, which is then the starter frames. And then we'll have some time for questions afterwards. What I have looked at is that it can be quite hard for people to read a 250-page book. It can also be quite hard. I mean, there are 26 frames in there, and there are a lot of times when it might seem overwhelming. What I have done is that in working on many, many different projects, and I'll give you an example in just a second, we found that we use the same set of starter frames over and over again as the core concept for building a strategy. Now, we're talking here about very deliberate, small, smart moves as a strategy instead of just waiting for luck to happen. The starter frames that we have are setting targets, allowing for emergence, catching a wave, balancing control, hubs and amplifiers, activating networks, harnessing the followership, and engaging the crowd. And if I give you an example of a project that I'm working on right now, and some of you may know some people that will apply, there's a project that I'm working on called the Global Teacher Prize. And the website is globalteacherprize.org. And an education philanthropist is creating basically the Nobel Prize for teaching. So this is really, I've been challenged with trying to find the world's best teacher who's innovative in the classroom, excellent in their profession, and is also promoting and driving the teaching profession. I need to find the world's best teacher. So if you know any teachers out there teaching kids between 5 and 18 in a school setting, please bring them in. And then, not only will they get credibility and support, but they'll also be getting, just as the Nobel Prize, $1 million for them to do as they see fit. So this is a pretty impressive prize. Well, what I've been looking at in helping do the design work for this prize is I've been stepping through the starter frames and then some of the more advanced frames to design the project for them. For example, in looking at these networks, it turns out that there are actually lots of other teacher prizes that exist around the world. And I'm sure Nigeria has a teacher prize, South Africa definitely does, America does. Well, maybe we can create a network of networks by contacting all of these prize organizations to saying, you've already found the best teacher in Nigeria. Can they please apply to our program where maybe they might win $1 million? It benefits that particular prize organization because if their prize nominee wins, it makes them look even better and their country better as well. And it means that it dramatically reduces the effort that we need to have because effectively that's a network of pre-filtered people that would already qualify. So that would be a practical example then of using these frames to design a project. This is something that's very much work in progress right now. But with that, and if you have the last book, and I can send a sort of a discount code if anybody's interested. But so that's the details for the book. There is, if you look at the next slide, the final slide, that has my email address. It's also got my Twitter handle, and then you can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. And the Start Scaling book then has the book. It has a free chapter. And then you can really sort of get your hands onto it and really begin to sort of build out things that can actually scale. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and hopefully we'll find a way of having some questions now. But thank you, thank you, thank you.
Somebody hand crane the program there. This speaking.
So are there any questions from the audience?
At this point, we'll be taking questions. So if you have any questions, please signify by raising up your hand.
Can you go back to that first slide?
Good afternoon, Mr. Torres. Thank you for your time. My question is this. We're talking about scaling, achieving big results with small, smart solutions plus good fortune. I want to know that element of good fortune. How can we create that element of good fortune to create this big result? Because I know even in Africa, in Lagos, we have a lot of small, smart solutions, but that element of good fortune is not really there. Is this something we can really create for ourselves?
Okay. Can somebody repeat the question close to mic? There was, unfortunately, I had some background noise. So can somebody just repeat the question for me quickly?
Okay, I said when you talk about scaling,
Okay.
you mentioned two elements: small, smart solutions and good fortune. I want to know how can one really create that element of good fortune that is key to, making this big impact.
Very, very good question. So I'm not a believer in complete luck. For me, luck is when you win the lottery and you did not buy a ticket. So that's real luck. Outside of that, everything else is hard work. So one of the ways to basically make your luck, there's one rule that I have called fish where the fish are. So let's say that you're looking to raise money for your project. Well, okay. There are investor conferences that take place very regularly in Lagos and other places. Go there and hang out with people. You don't know who you will meet. By the way, this is going to give you a really, really good take advantage of luck, but also help you to get whatever you want. I won't ask for a show of hands. I will assume that the people in the audience would like to get whatever they want. Now, be careful with this gift. Be careful with it, because be careful what you wish for. To get whatever you want takes three things. The first thing is to know what it is that you want. That's the first thing. The second thing is to give yourself a time frame. By what time do you want to achieve it? The third thing is actually the most important thing of all, and it's very spooky. The third thing is tell as many people as possible what it is that you want. Because it turns out that you create your luck by pretty much, effectively telling the world, and you do it at volume, because you don't know who can help you, but if you do it at volume, somebody will help. And it actually goes into the the spooky world of abundance. I found the answer to, for those people that don't quite see it yet, I'm going to ask you a quick math question in the audience. So if there are 30 people in a group, what is the percentage likelihood, you think, that 2 or more people share a birthday, day and month? So some of you will be thinking very small, maybe 2%, maybe 5%. Other people might be thinking maybe 10%. There'll be very few people in the room that will actually have the correct answer. The correct answer is 71%. And the reason why it is so high, the possibility of matching, is that right now in our heads we're egotistical. So I might be thinking, who matches the 3rd of March, which is my birthday? Well, if we were to go around the audience and people list off their dates, we very quickly see that we're not trying to match my date, we're trying to have anybody matching anybody. And then the world of abundance, this is really where the crowd power and emergence comes in. Pretty much everything is possible. So to create your own luck, you have to get out there. Nothing exciting is going to happen in a hotel room. Nothing exciting is going to happen if you hang out with the same people over and over again. There's a scaling frame that we use called long jump networks. And this pretty much means how do you deliberately get people in your own network, either in your business network, personal network, professional network, that are, let's say, that you don't hang out with. For example, the fact that I'm doing this talk is because I'm a judge on the Holt Prize, and there was a great student team here from the Lagos Business School that were there in London, and they invited me to speak. So now that long jump has now given a connection between Lagos, Berlin, and London in a way that is magical. But we're designing luck here. This isn't just happening and you're not waiting for it to happen. You can make your own fortune. So I strongly urge you to use some of those tactics to do that. But great question, really good. Thank you. Another question?
Any still camera?
I have lost the smartphone. Can you just hold on this? You want to move your phone? No, change it.
I did that question.
Okay.
Okay, Mike Toro, I think there's no question. There are no more questions here from the audience.
Okay, well, hey, I'd like to say thank you very much for spending your time. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I do hope to come to Lagos later on this year and definitely for next year. And maybe we can do this again in person.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the time.
Very good. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.
You too, sir.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Please. At this point,
Yeah, thank you.
At this point, I'm introducing Olamide. Please give a round of applause, please.
On behalf of the African Business Council,
Please come and put your.
I'd like to say a big thank you to
It's
everyone
done
for
already.
being here to our event today. We hope the conference
Your
met your
picture.
expectations and the discussions have stirred up ideas about the integrity in Nigeria and in Africa move forward. So thank you for being here. We will now have a networking session event downstairs in the foyer for the SMEs and for the investors. The aim of this is a bridging event, and the aim of this event is to allow the investors invest in new ideas of SMEs and so if you're an invited SME or a registered SME, please sit downstairs in the foyer for the networking cocktail event. Hopefully, this time next year, we will have a representative from the SME that has benefited from the bridging event. For the remaining of us that are not involved in that event, we would like to say a big thank you again for being a part of the Africa Business Conference 2014, and we hope to see you in the Africa Business Conference 2015. We wish you a safe trip back to your various destinations. Thank you, and God bless.
Okay. Stay. They're good though. They're good. That is not this thing. That's a view. Are we good?
Alright. So, finally done. Did you create a page on Google? I mean,
Yes.
sorry, YouTube.